to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Friday, May 8th, 2015. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645, 877-300-7645. Tom is sitting in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. The lovely Lady Claire will be joining us today in our third hour with her unique point of view about current events here. Now, today is the 70th anniversary of VE Day, and they're doing the celebrations and the military flyovers. They flew a bunch of vintage World War II planes all over Washington, D.C. One of them actually had to make an emergency landing. They are, after all, getting old. And needless to say, this weekend we will be treated to an endless barrage of movies celebrating how America won World War II, which is not entirely accurate, because the U.S. didn't show up until after Roosevelt put that whole Pearl Harbor thing together, and by then the Russians, and more to the point, the Russian winter, had already pretty much slammed the German armies. And if you ask people in Europe who won World War II, they say, well, we did. You know, we're glad the Americans showed up and all their extra little manufactured goodies. And, of course, the subtext from all of that is, you know, we shouldn't be afraid of World War III because we won the last two. Well, you know, that's gambler's ruin on the edge there. And speaking of which here, the corporate media is ramping up the booga-booga over the security alert level at military bases is being raised because of the threat of ISIS. And apparently FBI Director James Comey told reporters there are thousands of ISIS in America. Now, yesterday, they were saying there was 70 of them. And now, in the space of 24 hours, they have smuggled all those 1,000 in, which is another reason we should be closing our borders with Mexico. But all of this, of course, is coming out of the claim from Rita Katz's Site Intelligence Group that they found an Islamist website that took credit for the attempted shooting in Garland, Texas, and then followed it up by saying, we have 70 ISIS inside the United States in 15 states, and we will strike soon. Now, the Pentagon has been very forthcoming in saying that they actually don't have a credible, specific threat right now. They're just going along with this theater pageant, this wagging the ISIS at you, to convince you that ISIS is getting ready to do something really, really bad. Which tells us that if there is a Big Bang, there are basically two conclusions from it. One, it's our government or Israel with another false flag, that being their track record. And for those who are still desperate to cling to the official story of anything, a Big Bang proves that NSA, CIA, FBI, TSA, all of those failed utterly. They've been spending our money like it's confetti, violating our constitutional rights under the guise that they will protect us from terrorism. If there's a Big Bang, well, they failed. I want a refund. I want my Bill of Rights back. Now, over in Great Britain, they've had their elections, and the outcome was a bit of a surprise. It didn't quite line up with the polls going into the election, which normally would indicate vote fraud, but in a friendly country it means, oh, the pollsters, how could they be so wrong? Well, obviously the voters were lying to the exit pollers, which we hear over here. David Cameron's Conservative Party won a major victory over Labour in Great Britain, which the polls said they were neck and neck. And there's a crushing defeat. And, of course, there's already these allegations about ballots showed up without the UKIP candidates on them at all. All kinds of problems with the postal voting system. People didn't get their ballots in time. Huge numbers of ballots showed up at the last second. Nobody knows where they came from. And so it reeks of another stolen, crooked election. But the surprise came out of Scotland, where the Independent Party basically cleaned up almost all of the seats that Scotland has in Parliament. And former British diplomat Craig Murray is saying we can expect another independence referendum in Scotland very, very soon. And I think this time those Scottish people are going to be watching those vote counters very, very carefully. And any of them caught cheating will get whacked in the head with William Wallace's sword. All right, we're going to grab a phone call here. John in Barbados, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Yeah, continuing on the vein of the UK election, the Scottish Independence Party, the Scottish Nationalists, virtually wiping the board in Scotland, is going to create some sort of a constitutional crisis very shortly. And if Scotland does gain its independence, that will break the back of the Westminster government. It will be relegated to third world status, I'm sure.
Well, it could very well be, and we know that the British Royals will try and rig this next election the way they very blatantly and obviously did last time. And I have to wonder if the obviousness with which the last Scottish referendum was stolen was done to send a message, don't bother having any more of these referendums, we're not going to let you go, and that's just the end of it, and succeeded in doing nothing more than really angering the Scots. And I
believe this was actually a referendum on the referendum. The denials and the spin that's coming out of Westminster is ridiculous. The Scots were angered and they took their revenge and virtually wiped all the Westminster seats out of Scotland. What they did, there was just one Liberal Democrat seat, there's one Conservative and one Labour seat. That's 56 out of 59 seats the Scottish Nationalists won.
Yeah, that's a message right there. And maybe David Cameron was too busy stealing the vote away from the Labour Party to pay attention to what was going on up in Scotland. But that's a very clear message coming on down there. And yes, there's going to be another independence referendum. I hope the Scottish people take the task seriously of keeping an eye on those who are running that election and send a message. Anybody caught trying to rig that vote to deny Scotland independence, you know, bad things are going to happen to you.
Well, the thing is, the Inland Revenue Service is run from Colborne. It is a part of Glasgow in Scotland. And if Scotland cedes from the Union, that's going to ruin the tax service in Britain.
Well, it's not only going to do, well, I'm sure they can relocate the office. The big problem, of course, is that Great Britain makes a huge profit off of oil that is in Scottish territory. If Scotland breaks off, they're going to get the financial advantage of their own natural resources, and Britain's going to have to buy the oil. And, that was why they stole the last referendum. But having done it once, they're not going to be able to do it a second time. What's Britain going to do? Dig up Edward the Longshanks and send him to invade Scotland again?
I think William Wallace will be meeting him head on.
I imagine so. I'll loan my sword.
But the thing is, that Scotland would have an enormous income, never mind its whiskey. It would build a sovereign wealth fund of enormous proportions in very little time. And I don't think that could be allowed to happen. There would be some flashback, but this victory by the Scottish Nationalists was so huge, it even outstripped the expectations by a good margin.
Oh, I'm going to buy myself a nice bottle of scotch direct from Scotland tonight to celebrate with. All right, we got to take a break for commercials. John, thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go here, and we'll be back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. One of the other upsets from the British elections is George Galloway lost his seat to New Labour's Naz Shah by a wide margin, in fact, almost 2-1. Whether he lost it legitimately or he was part of the massive election fraud that we now know was going on, I don't know. We're going to grab ourselves another phone call here. Jay in Maryland. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. I wanted to give you kudos for posting the video to the Battle of Athens a few days back. That was a tremendous video, and I had no idea about that situation until I listened to your show.
Well, you know, the government doesn't want you to know about times when the citizenry have taken up arms against political corruption. Might give you slaves uppity ideas. Can't let you be thinking about that kind of stuff. But yes, it is a very important part of American history. There have been others like it, like the Tennessee Whiskey Rebellion and so forth. But schools don't teach those things where the American people actually got upset enough with the government to start shooting at them, except for the Civil War. It's kind of hard to gloss that one over.
I agree. I think most of what I learned in school has been equine excrement artistry. But anyway, one other question I wanted to ask is there a website somewhere where I can look at talk radio ratings? Because I'm curious how you and AJ and other people compare with the Rachel Maddows and Bill O'Reillys of the world.
Well, the Rachel Maddows and the Bill O'Reillys of the world have a ratings service which... Arbitron, it's called. And unfortunately, Arbitron does not yet deign to rate the independent media broadcasters. So we actually have a very hard time, not so much determining our ratings as, you know, we'd like to know what our true audience size is. And it's very difficult. We know that a lot of the streams that go out of GCN are going to people with Part 15 hobby transmitters to serve their local neighborhood. It's up on the satellite. We know people are taking it down from there. We do know that we do have some on-air affiliates carrying this show on the AM talk band. We picked up a couple just this last month. And, of course, the podcasts get passed around. We actually don't have a good read for how many people are following this show. But I think we're reaching enough of an audience where we're making a difference.
Well, I think that these people don't want to know the real ratings because you're probably kicking the crap out of them.
Well, we do know in terms of total audience, the independent media is already pulling a much larger part of the American audience than traditional corporate media is. The corporate media argues with each other over what share of the audience they have to set their advertising revenues. What they don't talk about is the total audience they are dividing amongst themselves has been in decline for going on 18 years. And polls are showing the majority of the American people are coming to the independent media to find out what's going on. That's why Washington is trying to find some way they can shut it down or control it. The FCC is talking about censoring the content of the independent media as part of net neutrality. That, of course, is a complete violation of the First Amendment. But they are very much scared because for decades, half a century, they have been able to get what they wanted from the American people by just lying to them constantly about everything, and now they can't do that anymore. And we're seeing all of these propaganda stunts and these booga-booga and the rest of it. It's not getting traction. The American people are sick and tired of war. They don't want any more. People are waking up to the reality of what private central banking is in terms of being a tool of enslavement rather than a tool of prosperity. And the government's in a panic. They don't know how to get people back to being blind, believing sheep like they were in the 1950s and 1960s. And
I don't think that's gonna happen anymore. But
not anytime soon.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Have a good weekend.
All right, thanks an awful lot. Thank you for the kind words. We're going to let you go here. And what's really kind of amazing is we're seeing all these people in Washington, D.C., and the corporate media who are bemoaning the loss of public trust in them. That Harvard study, where only 2% of young Americans between, I think it was the ages of 18 and 29, which is a major demographic regarding disposable income, only 2% of those trust the corporate media. And, of course, the response by the corporate media and the government is not to look at their long track record of lying to the public as being the cause of the loss of trust. Oh, no, it's the fault of those independent media people. They're getting in the way. Our job is to lie the people to this country into giving us more money and children for soldiers. Those independent media truth tellers, they're just getting in the way of that. And that really is their attitude. They're unwilling to look in a mirror at how their own behavior has brought about the collapse of trust in the government and the corporate media and the financial center and vaccines and global warming, so forth and so on here. Now then, getting on back to the international news, story out of Sputnik News, Putin's brilliant diplomacy to bring the West and Iran to the negotiation tables. And basically, Huffington Post columnist Didier Chaudet analyzed Russia's decision to sell Iran the S-300 missile defense system. And it wasn't just based on economics. It was basically moving the possibility of a direct military strike on Iran out of reach of Israel and the United States, returning to the negotiation table as the only realistic possibility. Now, unfortunately, with Israel's brand new ultra-right-wing government just slightly to the right of Attila the Hun, they may go ahead and attack Iran anyway and then step back and say, you Americans, you protect us from the retaliation, because that's what you Americans are for, of course. More condemnation coming out of Russia about how Western propagandists continue to invent myths of Russia's Baltic advance. And we know why the U.S. government is doing it. The U.S. government botched the overthrow of Kiev January of last year. Turned it into a civil war. We are now hearing word that Kiev may simply give up on trying to retake the Donbass and just let them go and say, yeah, go ahead, be your independent republic. See if I care. Poroshenko's going to be throwing chocolates at the wall of his presidential office. But basically, the U.S. is trying to conceal from the American people this latest in a long series of operations to covertly overthrow governments of other countries and replace them with U.S. puppets. That's what they were doing in Ukraine. It has blown up into a major crisis, and all the U.S. can think of doing is just continue to tell the American people, oh, this is all Russia's fault. Rest assured, Russia's behind. Russia's to blame for all of this upset. Don't even think about looking at Washington, D.C. We're the good guys. The Russians are the bad guys. And you should believe what we tell you to believe, or the terrorists will win, blah, 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 blah. Now, Russia is also upset over the fact that they have discovered that NATO intelligence operatives, spies, for lack of a better word, are prowling around near the border of Russia carrying the flag of the OSCE, which are supposed to be independent international observers, and instead they're turning out to be spies operating under that cover. So Russia's a little upset about that, and frankly, they have every right to be. Meanwhile, Putin just dismissed nearly 20 generals. That's a significant development. He's obviously weeding out the hacks, the nepotists, and the dullards, because he knows that the U.S. is still pushing to start a war with him. Got to take a break for commercials. Got a caller waiting on the line, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, yesterday we were talking about how Russia is throwing an economic assist toward Greece by offering to finance the development of a new oil and gas pipeline that will go around Ukraine. And, of course, Greece, being the terminal port for that, will receive a financial benefit as a transit point for all that oil and gas. And that's a good thing. So what does the United States do? They're over there wagging their finger at Greece saying, don't you dare do that. Don't you do business with Russia. We don't care if you're broken on the edge of bankruptcy and we've got you strangled to death. Don't you do business with Russia. And I don't think the government of Greece is going to listen to the United States of America. And that, it turns out, is a global trend, because there's an article over at Dark Moon saying that America's control over the rest of the world is rapidly eroding. And it basically says, the world is now awake to how the United States has been conducting business with this long history of highly aggressive military actions, as well as covert interference in the internal affairs of countless countries. And we're seeing around the world countries standing up and kicking out their U.S. puppets. And that is why the U.S. is having to go back into Iraq for a third time, back into Libya for a second time, back into Yemen for a second time, trying to get back into Iran. They haven't forgiven 1979 when the U.S. puppet ruler, the Shah, was kicked out. And all those people screaming about normalizing relations with Cuba, that also goes back to when the Cuban people kicked out the U.S. puppet, Batista. And the U.S. intelligence agencies, they know how to hold a grudge for generation after generation. They don't like the idea of a planet with independent nations. They're all supposed to be conquered provinces of the new American empire for Caesar to do with as he will. All right, we're going to grab ourselves a phone call here. This is Dave in Michigan. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, great show, Mike. How you doing?
Doing fine.
Good. My buddy just called me from Texas. His folks moved into an assisted living home here in Michigan last year.
Mm-hmm.
And he said his mom just called him and said his dad just got approved for disability through the VA for $1,700 a month. He was in the Army in the 50s, did a 2-year enlisted. He was a photographer because he was a conscientious objector. He did not deploy. He did not get injured, and they have him listed as being disabled from non-military injuries, and they're paying him $1,700 a month.
Well,
something's going on.
Well, don't spoil it for them. I mean, most of the people who served in the military aren't getting anything. I mean, this guy's getting.
That's what I'm saying. There are people that are deserving of. And she's told him that there's several people in the community that they're living in that when you move into one of these assisted living places, they take ownership of everything you have.
I know.
So they must be getting a humongous kickback. He's getting back pay from last February. He's going to get a big check, but I bet you they get it.
Well, they get part of it, obviously, but it all depends on the degree of care that the people require. And I have some experience with this because during my first marriage to Broadzilla, we had to put her father in an assisted living facility. But he still had his mind was absolutely fine, and they basically let him run his own finances. But for people who are in an assisted living facility where they're not mentally competent, then the facility takes over more and more of their finances. So it's kind of a continuous scale. It's not an absolute. But, I'm glad at least this guy is getting something here. And you're right, there are a lot of veterans who deserve a lot better care than what they've been getting. Part of it is the system is just totally messed up. They're still working with paper files. They've been unable to computerize. And we've even had, like, The Daily Show poke fun at this disastrous filing system, which is basically rooms full of stacks of boxes is what it is. And it is a hopeless mess. And it's the aftermath of the fact that, yes, the U.S. government is in a constant state of war or conflict with somebody somewhere. We've had, maybe 12 years of peace in the entire history of this nation. And needless to say, these veterans, do collect. And whether you agree with the wars or not, we do owe those people a debt of honor to take care of them, those who have been harmed in these wars. We're not going to get the money junkies who profited from the wars to take care of them. I remember Donald Rumsfeld was bemoaning the fact that too many of the wounded were surviving in Iraq. It was just spoiling their spreadsheet. We weren't expecting this many to survive. Their patriotic thing to do is die the instant you're shot over there. And that was the attitude. I mean, they're just treating it like it's a business, and we're just, human capital, livestock, and too many are surviving their wounds. That's a loss area. We got to do something about that.
Well, this guy's 84 years old. He's on Social Security, and he gets a pension from GM.
Well,
he does not need that money.
Well, I don't want to start tinkering with the system here on the side of people who are getting the money. He did serve in the military, and apparently he is disabled, non-combat. From what you just
he's not disabled though. I mean, he's got some medical issues that are from poor diet, and he's nutritionally deficient by choice. But it's not. I mean, he's definitely not disabled.
Okay, well, Dave, I got to tell you, I'd rather focus on those veterans who need the help and aren't getting it. That's where we got to put our focus and our energy right now.
Well, I agree. That's why I'm calling to, because somebody's got to investigate this.
All right, Dave. Okay, I made my point. We have to focus on those veterans who actually were wounded, permanently disabled in war, and the government is neglecting them. Let's put our focus on that. Okay? Now then, getting on back to the international situation. He who hesitates is lost. U.S. enters Arctic energy war. This is an article out of Sputnik News. And what's interesting is they're starting to talk about how the nations that surround the Arctic region are starting to basically draw their territorial lines as to, what they have. And it's interesting because the word we're getting, the spin we're getting from the U.S. is how dare Russia project into the Arctic. But if you look at the actual map, and we did link to it from whatreallyhappened.com, Russia basically took its shoreline and projected it up to the North Pole and stopped. But if you look at the territorial claims coming from the U.S., Canada, Norway, Denmark, they're going into the Arctic and projecting over to the other side of the hemisphere. Because there's a lot of oil up there. And they're talking about having a war at the North Pole. Going to shoot up Santa Claus's workshop if they're not careful. Fighting over those oil territories. And Russia isn't the one that drew the line over to the other side of the world. And the U.S. is just now getting into that. Russia's already prepared for Arctic warfare because of their weather. The U.S. a little less so here. Still getting more fallout over the fact that the United States has approved Saudi Arabia's use of banned cluster bombs on the people of Yemen, but the Saudis are promising that they'll be really careful to only hit the bad people. And, of course, the reason so many nations around the world have signed a treaty banning cluster bombs is they are not confined to the bad people. They kill a lot of innocents. It's an area weapon. It just destroys everything in the area, good guys, bad guys, cats, dogs, cows, chickens, everything. And the real danger is that some of those submunitions do not detonate when used. They'll detonate weeks or months later, causing all kinds of injury. All right, we got to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, over in Syria, the Syrian army apparently succeeded in ambushing a large contingent of the hired foreign mercenaries in As-Suwaida and confiscated a huge amount of weapons that were manufactured in both Israel and the United States of America, further underscoring the fact that these hired mercenaries are not a genuine revolution by the people of Syria against Bashar al-Assad. It's another bought and paid for invasion by proxy. And they've been trying to get Assad out of there for 4 years now. And he's still there. And they're out there like, oh, he's got sarin, he's got a Death Star, he's got Bigfoot harnessed on his car, whatever they're going to say here. All right, we're going to go back to the phones here. Glenn in Pennsylvania. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Mike. I'm following the reports about the British election, the election in the UK. I heard one interesting theory that could account for some of the vote, the statistical situation with the voting, and that is that in order to avoid allowing the Liberals to win by, having the rest of the populace split, that there were a significant number of people from Nigel Farage's UKIP party who shifted over to the Conservatives as a lesser evil. They'd rather see knowing that they didn't have the numbers to get in, they'd rather see the Cameron in than the Liberals.
That's not like kind of a minor aspect. I think a more important thing that we need to be looking at is why so many of the ballots went out where the UKIP candidates weren't even listed, even though they were supposed to be.
Right. Oh, yeah, sure. Certainly there was, that's fraudulent. But, like we see, for example, we see this phenomenon going on with what's going on with our election. Everybody and his brothers declaring to run as a Republican. Well, the Republican vote, the conservative vote's going to be so split up, potentially. If they narrow it down to 2 and stuff, we could see that sort of deliberate, party splitting here to help shoe in the Liberal candidate.
Okay, Glenn, yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off here, but, we have reports of massive election fraud. I think we need to look at that. I don't think we need to look past that to try and analyze why the election came out the way it did when we know that there is a certain degree of fraud that has to be accounted for first. That's like...
Well, I think both. Yeah, both. Okay. I mean, in other words, there could be a legitimate phenomenon as well as the fraud. Certainly, we want to do the same thing here to go after the fraud.
How do you tell if there's been a legitimate phenomenon if the vote itself is defective and known to be false?
I'm agreeing. Right. And then once that's fixed, you still have these other phenomena as well. Even in a non-fixed election, you can have party splits because of competing parties or candidates.
That would be a valid discussion if we had a verifiable, honest, accurate election, but we don't. So you're kind of guessing on the base of erroneous data, not unlike the global warming people.
No, I'm not. Well, I'm just saying it's an established phenomenon of third parties causing splits. But hey, by the way, don't forget to tell that English person that the plural of referendum is referenda. Probably one of those silly English kniggets, anyway.
Yeah, well, American English is kind of botched up mishmash from several different sources, and that's what makes it so difficult for people who come from countries with rational languages to learn about. All right, Glenn, I got to let you go. Thank you very much. We're coming up on the top here, and we're looking at multiple reports of problems with this British election. And mind you, it was being run by the same government that very openly and blatantly in your face stole the last Scottish independence referendum. So I think going past that to try and analyze what might have happened as if we assume that the election is accurate is kind of a pointless exercise. Anyway, now then, the Israeli media is starting to moan and tear their hair over indications that Barack Obama may support a Palestinian statehood initiative at the United Nations. This is Obama's payback for Netanyahu's end running him before Congress. And Obama does not appear to be in a forgiving mood, nor should he be on this one. And so we're basically looking at this new ultra-right government in Israel that wants to just crush Palestine out of existence. Palestine is going to the International Criminal Court over the war crimes. They're at the United Nations. The General Assembly has acknowledged Palestinian statehood, and they're moving forward on that. And Israel could throw a tantrum. And we know from John F. Kennedy what can happen to presidents who defy Israel's will. Because along with annoying the heck out of the Federal Reserve, John F. Kennedy was adamant that Israel not be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. And his successor, Lyndon Johnson, did a complete 180 and said, sure, help yourself. And it was at that point Israel started getting weapons-grade uranium from the United States of America for its first-generation weapons. Okay, we seem to have an unidentified caller on the line. I'm going to go ahead. I don't know who you are or where you're calling from, but what's on your mind?
Florida.
Hello? Is anybody there? No, I guess not. Must have been a mistake with the hamster and the wire wheel. Meanwhile, the U.S. government is denouncing Israel's announced construction of 900 Jewish-only settlements in East Jerusalem. They're calling it a disappointing development, which is diplomatic speak for, we are not pleased. We do not agree. And the U.S. State Department spokesman Jeff Rathke is saying that this approval of the construction of these new settlements in East Jerusalem is a problem, okay? Yet, if it's that much of a problem, why is the U.S. government still sending Israel checks full of billions of your tax dollars to build these settlements? Because it's one thing to say Israel is doing bad things with the money and quite another to go on sending the money there. There's obviously a problem of some kind that should be dealt with. A lot of Israel's misbehavior would be curtailed if they were having to pay for it themselves. Alrighty, moving on here. Let's see. FBI warning local cops Islamic State could soon execute 9/11 scale attack in the U.S. They want to keep you afraid. Booga, booga, booga. All right, turning to the economy. The European Central Bank is considering tightening the Greek Emergency Liquidity Fund, the Emergency Liquidity Account, cutting off the flow of money to keep them going. Now, this reinforces the suggestion that the report earlier in the week that Greece had succeeded in making the payment that was due this week may have been slightly exaggerated. Now, understanding the repercussions of a Greek failure to meet that payment, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that they would announce the payment was made in order to prevent the activation of credit default swaps across Europe and the United States of America. But this move by the ECB suggests that maybe the payment was not made in full. Now, in response to the word from the ECB about tightening up the emergency liquidity account, Greece is now talking about using a parallel currency. What they're talking about is they're going to start issuing their own internal currency, probably call it the drachma again, and start running their country internally on the drachma. And that, of course, is a stepping stone to Greece leaving the EU. All right, we're going to go back to the phones here. Steve in Florida, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Oh, yeah, sure. $1 trillion here and $1 trillion there. Pretty soon, you know, we're talking about some serious money.
Yes.
You got me on that one yesterday. Yeah, but I wanted to, I thought that was funny. Anyway, I called about that, Dave saying that, this other guy shouldn't be on, disability and so forth. He doesn't know. He shouldn't be judge and jury.
No, he shouldn't. I mean, he shouldn't. We don't know the circumstances of the guy. I mean,
neither does he. He's not a doctor, you know.
Well, I think Dave's attitude is, you know, we know that the government is trying to basically say the veterans are costing us way too much money, we've got to start cutting back. And maybe they are. I mean, there's a lot of ways going on, but I think the focus needs to be on those veterans who have been disabled in combat for the wars for the money junkies. They're not getting the care they're supposed to. I think we need to keep the focus on that. Steve, there's the music. We got to take a break for news. Thank you for the phone call. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645. We've got a caller waiting on the line here. Cameron in the United Kingdom. Aloha. Welcome to the show. Gee, I wonder what you want to talk about.
Hi, good afternoon, Michael. I had a couple of things. Predictably, first one is about the election, and something that I think nobody's mentioned. We've had so many sort of, opinion polls and everything throughout this campaign. And in UK, it's illegal to talk about sort of elections during the election day. So during the election day, nobody talked about elections sort of in the media. And when the polls closed at 10 o'clock, immediately the first thing that because then the BBC's coverage started, and the first thing they said was, yes, Conservatives are going to win by a big majority, which was absolutely nonsense, because everybody knew, I mean, all the polls, Labour was either head-to-head or a point or a couple ahead. So, I mean, everybody who came there, even one of the politicians whom they had there as a guest, said, well, yeah, I'll eat my hat if Conservatives, if this poll that you've shown here is real, is true. So that's one thing. And the second thing is a question, Michael. What do you think is Greece waiting for, Syriza waiting for? I mean, this is getting really, really frustrating, especially for us in Europe. Because believe it or not, everybody in Europe is waiting for Greece to do something, and then they follow. But apparently nothing. I mean, they're not doing anything. They just want to sort of squeeze the last drop of blood out of the people before they sort of, again, probably submit to central banks.
Could very well be. I mean, I know the people of Greece are very upset with Tsipras and the Syriza party because from the point of view of the people of Greece, they're not keeping the promises on which they campaigned. And it may be that Syriza campaigned with the best of intentions, but other forces have been brought to bear on them. Blackmail information, bribes, we don't know. But everybody understands that this holding pattern Greece is in right now can't last. Supposedly they made the payment they were supposed to this week. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I'm getting a feeling that it wasn't a complete payment and everybody's hushing it up. But there are more payments coming soon that Greece simply cannot make. And I'm in agreement. I think Greece ought to just say, all right, that's it. This private central bank thing, the ECB, doesn't work. Much of this debt we're dealing with is odious because it was concocted out of thin air by Goldman Sachs and Papandreou. We're writing it off. We repudiate it. We're leaving the EU, and we're going to go be friends with Russia, which, you know, is treating its friends a lot more generously, like we saw in Cyprus.
Absolutely. I mean, as you've mentioned many times, Russia's red carpet's there for them to walk through. And the other thing is, I mean, they shouldn't really concern themselves with the credit rating that U.S. credit agency is going to give them, although it's junk already anyway. So, I mean, it really is a question mark.
Okay, Cameron, we got a problem with your phone connection. You're starting to cut in and out. We've had this problem with your phone calls before. So I'm going to have to let you go, and I apologize, even though it's not my fault. We don't know where the fault is, but the call is getting unintelligible. So thank you very much. We're going to let you go here. Now, interestingly enough, up in Canada, because of the firestorm of controversy in the independent media regarding the Comer lawsuit against the Bank of Canada, the corporate media is finally grudgingly having to acknowledge it. The CBC did a report on the Comer case, but they trivialized it and dismissed it as quixotic. They're not going to go anywhere, really. Yes, they're doing this, and this is their issue, but really, you shouldn't pay attention. So CBC is definitely towing the line of trying to make this thing go away so that the Canadian people don't see it, because the Canadian people have a legitimate reason to ask, why, if our system provides access to zero-interest money, is the government borrowing it at interest and charging us for that interest from private central banks? And we understand the Government of Canada is doing so as part of another deal having to do with banks in Europe. But clearly the government is making deals that benefit the banks and not the people. We have the same situation here in the United States. We're already hearing rumblings in the Congress about raising the debt ceiling. And by the way, the Treasury Department has frozen the U.S. debt figure for going on 2 months now, which means they've already gone over the debt ceiling. And they don't want you to be paying attention to that. And they're already starting to say about, we've got to raise the debt ceiling, and they shouldn't be. The question Okay, I apologize for that. My wife had a bit of a tragedy happen, and I had to go take care of that. So I apologize for the dead air and the music and everything. These things do happen. I'm one of those loving husbands. When I hear a shriek from my wife, I have to go investigate. So anyway, we were talking about the economy, and the question all Americans need to be asking is not whether to raise the debt ceiling or not. The question every American should be asking, and please share this with your friends and family. The Constitution authorizes the U.S. government to create and issue an interest-free, value-based currency to support commerce, a public currency as a public utility. Why then is our government borrowing that money at interest from a privately owned central bank, condemning Americans for generations to come to pay that interest to the private central bank? Nobody has an answer for that. That's why they don't want you asking that question. Now then, over at politicalvelcraft.org, they have a very telling story, and this is not getting a lot of coverage in the corporate media, nor will it. Just a few weeks ago, 132 member nations of the United Nations have urged Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon to provide as soon as possible alternative options for banking services. In other words, they want to get away from this private central banking debt slavery system. And so from that, I think we can presume that the official U.S. government special high interest targets list now numbers 132. Because that's what all these U.S. wars are about. Forcing the world to go on being slaves to private central banks. Our private central bank. It is time for these private central banks to go away. They don't serve any useful purpose for society at all. They exist to extract wealth from the people. And they get away with it because politicians will sell you and even their own money for $1. And it is time for them to go. 132 nations, that is a major power block saying no more private central banking. And sign me up, I'm definitely on board with that. Because like Andrew Jackson, like Abraham Lincoln, like John F. Kennedy, I understand the true nature of this banking system. It is the exact same predatory banking system we fought a revolution to be free of, only to be sold back into that slavery by a corrupted Congress and a corrupted president. And it's time for it to end before it triggers a nuclear world war. We'll be back after these commercials. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show here. And in response to all the emails I'm getting, Claire's fine. Claire is okay. We're not having to call an ambulance or anything like that. It just was a momentary fright. I didn't know what was going on here. And when you get to be our AGE, loud noises can often signal issues. Claire does have a shoulder that comes out every once in a while because she had a disagreement with a horse in her youth. And so we have to deal with that from time to time. Alrighty, getting on back to the economy. And she's fine. She's still going to be here next hour. Getting on back to the economy, we're talking about how 132 nations have gone to the head of the United Nations and says there has to be an alternative system of global banking that does not involve borrowing money that's created out of thin air at interest from these privately owned central banks. These 132 nations have just joined the war against private central banks. And that really is a good idea for us to get rid of that because it's an outdated concept. It's a model of rulership based on artificially created bank debt, ruled by compound interest. And it's no more legitimate a form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And like those two former failed systems, it works only so long as you allow yourself to be brainwashed into thinking this is the way the world is supposed to be. And once you become a private banking heretic, like me, you understand that the way the economy was set up in this country when it was started is clearly a much better system for the nation and for its people. And the rest of the world is now waking up to that, finally. All right, we're going to go ahead and grab ourselves a phone call. Steve in Massachusetts, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. There's a weird commercial that's on TV. I don't know if you know anything about it. It's the AARP.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a lady, doing something. In the background, there's a TV going on. And the TV, it has... you can barely hear it. It's barely audible, but it says, riots nationwide have prompted government to declare martial law. And it says, the president is asking for citizens to find safety and remain calm. Then also he goes, the authorities are working to contain the outbreak. And it's just weird for that to be...
It does seem kind of cross purposes with ARP's stated mission, and a lot of people have commented about that commercial. If it's part of this drumbeat of getting us all ready for a declaration of martial law, which we understand. There are factions within Washington, D.C., they're tired of this Constitution and Bill of Rights thing, and they're trying to find some way to basically turn our nation all the way into a full-on fascist dictatorship, because remember what George Bush used to say, this would be a lot easier if it was a dictatorship, so long as I was a dictator. And, big old joke there over in Washington, D.C. is they try and basically destroy the original republic that is the core, the root of this nation, is that constitutional republic with democratically elected rulers. And we know there are people who are out there saying, yeah, if we're going to go out and conquer the world and bring them under the New World Order, we got to get rid of this democracy nonsense here in the U.S. first. And, a lot of people have observed multiple attempts by this government to try and kick up massive nationwide riots at Ferguson and more recently with Michael Brown and now this Freddie Gray situation. But they're not getting the traction because the American people understand that's what the government wants. And everybody is staying calm. We're kicking back and we're saying, we're going to watch the theater pageant of, racism are us theater. Wag the whites, wag the blacks, wag the reds and greens and so forth and so on. But the American people aren't going along with it because the American people have, over the last decade, developed a very healthy degree of skepticism and mistrust of the government. if for no other reason than it is the government. And you should never, ever trust government, ever, at any time, any place, any way.
Yeah, just like that slogan where they say Black Lives Matter. How about they should say Lives Matter?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's just another attempt to try and divide us. Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. And we know that blacks do not form an overwhelming majority of the people being abused by the police. There was that study that was done in Washington State. The police are 25 times more likely to pull the trigger on a white suspect. But the corporate media, which is trying to fan up this racial crisis out of thin air, only focuses on the black ones.
And I really don't think it's working.
I don't think it's working either because, you know, the American people, if there's one thing that unites them all, it's the awareness of how this government survives with dirty tricks. And that, I think, is our common ground across all races, creeds, colors, religions, orientations, genders, whatever.
Yeah, people are not that stupid. They're getting to the point where they are starting to wake up and find out what's going on. You know, there seems to be a small pushback. Whether it be comic, comic Core or you know, this racism and well, people are starting to wake up. Not really everybody's saying anything yet. I think people are just keeping quiet and waiting for a big event.
Let me put this to you. Okay, when you are a little tiny child, you don't know you're supposed to be upset, angry, afraid, or offended by anything. Whether it's nudity, gays, blacks, whatever. You have to be taught that for somebody's political economic gain. Rodgers and Hammerstein even wrote a song about that in South Pacific. You've got to be taught to hate and fear all of the people that your parents hate. It's a taught thing to be racist. Nobody's born racist. Nobody's born homophobic. Nobody is born, you know, with these kinds of feelings. They're all given to us, brainwashed into us to make us useful to somebody's political agenda.
Yeah, you got a point. That's definitely for sure. You know, people don't grow up that way without having been taught that way.
Exactly. And it's all to serve somebody's greed or somebody's political ambition. And it's time for us to outgrow that kind of nonsense. And it is. You know, it's time to put down these childish things. Okay?
Thank you. I want to thank you for all that you've been doing. You're an inspiration to us.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the kind words. I'm going to let you go here. We're coming up on another commercial break here. Getting on back to the economy, we're looking at another article over in Russia Today where it's out there saying, yes, the United States is trying to put roadblocks before China. China is on the verge of getting the yuan accepted as a reserve currency and added to what is now being described as the special drawing rights basket. And the U.S. is trying to prevent that. They're afraid of the yuan. They're afraid of the ruble. That's what's driving these wars to Russia and China. The U.S. wants only the dollar to be used for global trade and banking. Too late. It's already falling. And a nuclear world war, I don't think, is going to reverse that trend. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking about the economy. We're talking about how the U.S. is now openly out there trying to stop the rest of the world from going and out and doing their business with their own currencies and not involving the United States or, for that matter, the private central banks in their doings. And remember, it was earlier in the week, the Council on Foreign Relations came out and said China must be defeated because of the threat of the yuan to the dollar. So as you hear more and more propaganda about we've got to be tough on China, it's all about the money. World War III is being fought in an argument over whose brand of paper and ink currency the world is supposed to use for the next 100 years. And in service to that argument, the U.S. government is perfectly willing to send several million of our children off to be killed and crippled, just to make the bankers happy. Because, you know, those bankers are important people. They matter. They count. Your kids don't. You're smelly kids here. Another interesting article over here in Deviant Investor, the dollar danger zone. And it's going down through the same stuff we've been telling you for a long time. The U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency since Bretton Woods, 70 years. Even after Nixon ended gold convertibility, technically ending Bretton Woods, the U.S. maintained their dollar hegemony with the petrodollar and outright threat of military intervention if you didn't go on playing the rules by the rules the U.S. wanted you to play by. So Middle East oil and threat of military force have supported the world continuing to use the dollar as the reserve currency for about 40 years. Now, up until now, the world has been buying and selling oil in dollars. Therefore, the world has to acquire those dollars to obtain oil. And the process has been working exceedingly well for the U.S., but it's starting to fall apart. The reason for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, no, it was not weapons of mass destruction. Remember, they never found any. Saddam did not have nuclear weapons. That was the lie used to convince you that it was okay to send your kids over there to Iraq to be killed and crippled. The real reason for the 2003 invasion of Iraq was that in 2002, Saddam Hussein got permission from the United Nations to sell Iraq's oil for the euro under the Oil for Food program. Oh, weapons of mass destruction. They invade Iraq for the second time. They lynched Saddam Hussein, put Iraq's oil back on the world market only for the U.S. dollar. Fast forward to Libya under Gaddafi. And Gaddafi was doing really good things for his country and his people. Very high standard of living, high literacy. And then he establishes a state central bank, kicks out the private central bankers. He creates a new value-based currency, the gold dinar, and then announces Libya's oil is for sale for the gold dinar. U.S. invades Libya. They kill Gaddafi. The gold for the gold dinar has vanished. They've got a brand new private central bank enslaving the Libyan people to debt. That's what this is all about, enforcing debt slavery on the world through U.S. weapons of war. And the good news is the world now knows it. In fact, even this article, Dollar Danger Zone, how much longer can the U.S. maintain this dollar support process? I'm turning the egg timer over right now. It is falling apart. And I would hope saner minds in Wall Street and Washington, D.C. would say, this can't be made to work any longer. Let's not ignite a nuclear war over what is a failed policy anyway. Now, Timothy Geithner is out there acknowledging that despite all the feel-good, positive propaganda coming out from the government, the corporate media about how wonderful the economic recovery is doing, yeah, there's another crisis coming. It's unavoidable. He's promising it will not be as bad as 2008. But yeah, the indicators are there. And we know that what we're hearing on the corporate media, like unemployment rate, we know that's a complete fiction. We have a record 93 going on 94 million Americans willing and able to work who have not been able to find jobs for years. And the official U.S. government unemployment rate is only those who've been out of work a very short time and are still collecting unemployment benefits. Once the benefits run out, you are put in another category so they don't have to look at you anymore. Now, a little bit of good news for the people over at Boeing. Apparently, Iran is indicating they would like to start buying civilian airliners from Boeing. And there's a huge aviation market over there, and Boeing is looking over there and saying, yeah, we could sell them some airplanes. And, of course, what they're getting from the U.S. government is, no. You can't do business with Iran until they recognize Israel as a Jewish state and abandon their nuclear power program. If you are a patriotic American company, you will do as you're told and go bankrupt along with the rest of us. Because that's what's happening in the United States and Europe with all these sanctions. Russia's economy took a hit but has recovered. Iran is doing business with the rest of the world. These sanctions are actually harming domestic and European companies a lot more than the declared targets. And the U.S. government is pursuing this agenda for the same reason it continues to pursue Obamacare and human-caused global warming. They are institutionally incapable of ever admitting they've made a bad choice, a bad decision, a bad policy. They will not, cannot alter course, turn around, go back. Which is a very dangerous attitude to have in a government that's armed with nuclear weapons. April payrolls miss at 223,000. March has been revised much lower. Wage growth down again. And this is another repeating feature that we see. They'll come out at the beginning of a month. Oh, this month was great. The GDP was up. Huzzah, huzzah, huzzah. And they milk it for propaganda value. And then a couple of months down the road, they say, well, we've looked at the numbers again, and really it wasn't that good. But that was 2 months ago, so don't pay attention to it. It's almost like an automatic ritual in Washington, D.C. to declare the current month is wonderful, and then 2 months down the road admit that really it wasn't at all. Now, Republican Representative Kurt Clausen, Florida congressman, first term, was flipping shares in a solar company the same day he acquired them in an IPO, even though there is a federal law that prohibits members of Congress from participating in IPOs in order to not profit from them. Now, apparently, lawyers for the House of Representatives, in a brief file last summer, are now claiming that Congress can't be investigated for insider trading, that they are constitutionally protected from such inquiries given the nature of their work. In point of fact, they're not. And insider trading is a crime, regardless of who is doing it. And members of Congress have been getting rich, taking advantage of the information they have regarding pending legislation and running off to their brokers and profiting from it. There was even an attempt a year ago to pass a law reinforcing the idea that Congress is not supposed to be profiting from their inside information. Needless to say, Congress voted that down. And now they're trying to convince the Securities and Exchange Commission that the Constitution prohibits investigation of Congress for insider trading. No, it does not. The Constitution says that if a congressman is committing a crime, they get punished like anybody else. Meanwhile, the Obama administration is asserting that no legal court has a right to challenge executive declarations of secrecy, even if it is completely wrong. The White House is above the courts, and that too is not in the Constitution. We're seeing the rise of an imperial government that holds itself above the laws of the land. That is not America. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about politics and corruption. The two are inseparable. Now, we know that Hillary Rodham Clinton is out there, has been out all week talking about instant citizenship for immigrants coming across the border from Mexico. If they get across the fence, make them citizens, give them the right to vote. And she's courting the Hispanic vote because she's convinced that if she can get the Hispanic vote and the woman vote, that she will be president in 2016. Now, linked to the front page of WhatReallyHappened.com is a recording of Hillary Clinton in 2003 in which she says she's adamantly against illegal immigrants. So for all of you Hispanics, immigrants out there, if you vote for her next year, doesn't mean she's going to do anything. She's just saying what she thinks you want to hear to get your vote so she can go in the Oval Office. She is a classic politician. Will say and do anything to obtain the power, and then once she has the power, will do anything she wants with it. Show me a president in recent memory who has not followed that exact same pattern. Now, there continues to be growing scandals surrounding the Clinton Foundation. Now it's come out that at least 4 of the directors of the Clinton Foundation have either been charged or convicted of financial crimes, including bribery and fraud. We need to keep all of this stuff in the public mind here. Now, the good news is Hillary's poll numbers up in New Hampshire have her trailing 3 GOP candidates. Now, New Hampshire is traditionally Republican, but for the presumptive Democratic candidate to be that far behind is very, very telling. And we are hearing that some of Hillary's financial backers are leaving zeros off those checks or putting those checkbooks away. They're not entirely convinced she can win because of all the baggage she's carrying. She's dragging around more baggage than Kim Kardashian on a photo shoot. Vince Foster, Iran-Contra, Travelgate, Cattle Futures, Whitewater, Castle Grande, Flowerwood, Benghazi. all of that stuff is going to be following her into the election next year. All righty, now then. The State Department, though, is still in support of their former Secretary of State, and they've declared there is absolutely no intention of examining the undisclosed Clinton donors to see if there were conflicts of interest during Hillary's term as Secretary of State. Once the system goes corrupt, it goes all the way corrupt. And I think people are beginning to realize that. When we were young, we would look at an exposure of a corrupt politician. Oh, it's a unique incident. No, it isn't. We'd see a government lie exposed. Oh, how unusual. No, it's not unusual at all. The only unusual part was that you found out. But here we are all these years later, sadder and wiser, and realizing that government, by its very nature, is deceptive, abusive, manipulative. It is the curse of political power, that it attracts the very sort of people who should never, ever be allowed to have it. And that is why the founding fathers of this nation set up the nation the way they did, with power and authority diffused across all of society, with government broken into 3 branches that are supposed to keep an eye on each other, to absolutely, adamantly refuse any individual to acquire too much power and authority because of the long history of people with such power and authority unable to resist the temptation to abuse it. It's called the Führerprinzip. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we're seeing it in the American culture, American government right now. Story out of Russia Insider: Europeans wake up to mainstream media bias. And they're talking about a survey that was done from March 20th through April 9th in Great Britain, France, Germany, and Greece. And basically they're finding that the people of Europe are waking up to the realization that their corporate media cannot be trusted. Now, getting on back to that Harvard study that was done here, where only 2% of America's citizens between age 18 and 29 trust the corporate media. 2%. That's abysmal. Now, let's get on over here to Baltimore. I was looking at a story, we put it up at whatreallyhappened.com, where ever since Freddie Gray's death, there have been something like 15 other shooting deaths in Baltimore. They're not getting a lot of coverage. Freddie Gray was focused on, and it was a tragedy what happened to him, but they're using it to push this whole racism issue. And I guess they're not done trying to kick up race riots, because I'm looking at this story in which the murder charges against those 6 police officers may be dropped on the excuse that the investigation into Freddie Gray's death by the Baltimore police themselves does not support the prosecutor's allegations. See, we've investigated ourselves and we're innocent, so you got to drop all the charges. And if they do that, you know what's going to happen. They'll send in the agent provocateurs to break some more windows and try and kick up the rioting going again. Because they need something to justify a national emergency, martial law, and the shredding of what is left of our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Now, the Department of Justice has announced that they're going to investigate a pattern of racist policing in Baltimore. So it sounds good that they're going to go in and investigate, but again, they're coming in the context of racism, 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 racism. Because the goal is to divide the American people against ourselves. Black against white. Women against men. Gays against straight. To keep us arguing with each other, to prevent the possibility that the American people could unite together as an American people and deal with the real cause of all the suffering and hardship we have had to endure for the last quarter of a century, which is Wall Street, the private central bank, and a totally complicit government that sells itself like a cheap Santa Monica whore to anybody with money, whether it's Wall Street, big pharmaceutical companies, Israel. That's what Washington, D.C. is. It is a giant shopping center to buy this nation out from under we, the American people. Now, this Baltimore City's Office of the Public Defender has come out reporting that the Baltimore police wrongfully imprisoned 40 minors during the Freddie Gray protests. And they locked up 49 kids. Half of them were never even charged with a crime. They were just thrown in jail because the police wanted to throw them in jail. And that is contrary to the rules. If you're not being charged with a crime, they can't lock you up, and yet they did. Now, over in San Francisco, they're having to conduct an investigation into corruption inside the San Francisco Police Department. And I'm looking at this wonderful story out of Extra Public TV where the district attorney says the San Francisco Police Department is so crooked, they're having to bring in retired judges from outside to carry the investigation because the corruption spreads from the San Francisco Police Department into the San Francisco court system. Fish rot from the head. And once the system starts to go corrupt, it goes all the way corrupt. All hierarchical organizations inherit the manners and morality of the ones at the top. If you've got corrupted leadership, the whole system becomes corrupt. They don't want the non-corrupt around. It just gets in the way. The moral and the immoral are mutually exclusive societies. Neither one tolerates the presence of the other. And you should never get into this idea that, oh, the government only has a few corrupt people. If there's a few corrupt people in there and they're getting away with it, it tells you the whole system is corrupt. That's just common sense. Now, over in Los Angeles, their police union has gone on the attack against the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department for suggesting that the killing of a homeless man by an LA police officer was unjustified. And so the union's out there saying, you can't say that. Of course it was justified. The union doesn't know. They weren't there. They're just out there saying, we must protect the police at all times, even if they're doing something bad. And we've seen that from police unions all across the country. They're fighting the body cameras. They're fighting the release of video from dash and body cameras. They're not interested in right or wrong, justice or law enforcement. They exist to protect the police from bad publicity, even when the police deserve it. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 3. The phone lines are open, 877-300-7645. And for those of you watching on BAM User, the gorgeous creature sitting behind me is the lovely Lady Claire.
Yes, and I would like to open with a short apology for having moved Michael away from his headset a little earlier today. The only thing that is hurting is my dignity, and beyond that, I think I'm going to draw the curtain of charity. But I'd like to talk about a comment that I thought was very, it made me very uncomfortable. And it's America's richest congressman says poor in the U.S. are the envy of the world. Now, this guy is California GOP Representative Darrell Issa. And I wish that our Representative Issa would get out a little bit more. I'd like him to walk around areas like Compton, Watts, Wilmington, and as a former Angelino, I know those areas, okay? Because the manufacturing that used to prop up the American middle class has been allowed by our allegedly congressional representatives to be outsourced and offshored, making people who are left just with the possibility of working several jobs at minimum wage. So there is no real upward mobility for these people at all.
Well, I think probably the propaganda spin coming out there is don't be upset in your poverty because you're so much better at poverty than the rest of the world. And I don't think the people who are actually poor in this country are going to respond to this the way Darrell is hoping that they will. I think, if anything, it's going to fan the anger because people don't want to compare their lives with other nations' poor people. They're always instinctively comparing themselves to the people who are better off.
Right.
Because we start out with this political principle that all men are created equal, and we all champion our equality upward but never downward.
Yeah.
And Darrell seems to have forgotten that basic principle of psychology where people who are struggling to get along, they're not going to be mollified by being told that somebody else is worse off than they are.
No.
All they see is how bad off they are compared to the people who are truly well off in this country, and that's why the wealth inequality is becoming a major destabilizing issue in our society.
Absolutely. I'd like to move to another topic. A Kentucky free-range family loses custody of 10 kids over apparent unschooling. Now, these kids were homeschooled. And the mom and dad had some social media where they were talking about how they were educating their child. And apparently there had been sort of a Facebook kerfuffle between the dad and a neighbor who tipped off the police, who took the children for no other reason than they weren't going to a regular school.
They're not going through their government mandated brainwashing courtesy of Common Core.
And you know what I will be willing to bet? I bet these kids speak better, read better, do math better than many of their contemporaries who go to a public school.
Actually, you don't need to ask that. It's been shown consistently. Homeschool children are better academic achievers than kids who are going through the indoctrination of the public schools. But the goal of the public school system is, in fact, indoctrination, not education. And the government doesn't dare let anybody escape that system, because then they grow up to be, well, kind of like me, and very annoying to the power structure.
You know, some spelling bees across the country have literally forbidden homeschooled kids from competing because they just wipe the floor with everybody else.
Makes that public education system look bad, and we can't let public education look bad. We can't let the vaccine makers look bad. We can't make the automakers look bad. You know, we really have reached a stage in our social evolution of shadow over substance, where virtually all the effort coming out of government, corporations, is all about looking good to the public rather than actually being good. And this is more of the same.
But when your children can be taken away from you simply because you educate them differently, you don't live in a free society anymore. Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. And it's another indication that the government sees all of you as their property, as their livestock, whether it's saying you can't teach your kids, we will teach for you. You can't work on your own car. You will take this vaccine. You will eat this food. You will not eat this other food. And it really is. I mean, I don't think even Hitler got down to the point of going into the German people's home and saying, this is what you will eat and you're not allowed to eat that.
Yeah, it's really getting crazy out there. Next thing I'd like to talk about is the big business of cancer. Now, for the folks who don't know, this is a very sensitive area for both of us. Both of our moms died of either cancer or the treatment they got from the cancer.
Yeah.
Because they were using cobalt like a hammer and not like a feather. But last year, $100 billion, with a B, dollars were spent on cancer drugs last year alone. That's a big figure.
Yeah, it is big business here, and as a matter of fact, last year when I was going through my medical crisis at the hospital, right at the start, they told me I had cancer. And even before the doctor had left the room, the salespeople were in there with their brochures for this treatment center and this approach and this thing. And I had to deal with that for about 2 hours, and then the doctor came back and said, we made a mistake. You don't actually have cancer. You have pneumonia. And you could just see the look on these people's faces. Oh, we lost another one. It was, can't you give him cancer? Because we're here about to close the sale.
Now, there are effective, far less toxic and expensive treatments for cancer, which absolutely work.
But they're not allowed here because of the fact that they are far lower in cost. And remember, there are oncologists who have been thrown in prison for telling patients they have cancer when they don't, just to sell them all of this stuff.
And one of the things I discovered in this particular article, when they were doing trials of hydrazine sulfate, the National Cancer Institute, allegedly a very renowned body of people, decided the best way to handle the situation was to sponsor the study so they had complete control. Now, there were a couple of things you cannot do with hydrazine sulfate. Dosage had to be critical. Too high a dose created toxicity. But over and above that, patients had to absolutely avoid certain other drugs, including alcohol, barbiturates, and antidepressants. These negated hydrazine sulfate's action. Yet, in the NCI trials, 94% of the patients were taking those drugs that had been determined to be detrimental to the use of hydrazine sulfate.
There were some other drugs that were contraindicated for the hydrazine sulfate, and during the trials, the patients were told, take these drugs. In other words, the tests were rigged to discredit hydrazine sulfate because it's a very inexpensive cancer treatment. It's not a cure. Nobody's saying it's a cure. But it is a treatment that reduces the symptoms. Now, here's another little aspect you need to keep in mind. 25% of all cancers spontaneously go away all on their own. The attitude of the cancer cartel is, well, we don't know which 25% that's going to be, so we're just going to treat them all. And it is big business.
Yeah.
And it's become such a huge economic power. And nobody's looking for a cancer cure. Nobody in this entire medical industrial complex wants to cure anything. What they want are treatments. Because if you have cancer or AIDS or any of this other stuff, and I cure you, you go away and I never see you again. But if I'm selling you a treatment month after month after month after month after month, you're a permanent, reliable source of revenue. Have you never wondered about all these commercials about donate money, we're seeking the cure for this or that, and yet no matter how much money they collect, no cure is ever found because the money isn't spent looking for a cure. It's spent developing treatments.
But I'd like to get to the end of this, which was that in '87, Jeff Kamen, at the time a Washington correspondent for Independent News Network, ran a series of articles about how the NCI was trying to suppress the truth. His stories led to a House Oversight Subcommittee ordering an investigation by the GAO.
And all of this was publicized by Bob Guccione, whose wife had gone through the hydrazine sulfate. And they made it public awareness. We got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And before we get back to the cancer story, and it's all about the money, it's not about health, we're going to grab a phone call here. We're going to go to Dustin in New Jersey. Aloha, Dustin. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Mike. Hi, Claire.
Hi.
Basically, the governments around the world want everybody dependent on them. You know, like the water supply, the schooling, the vaccines, and, you know, you control that. You control the population. That's why the majority of people around the world, look at the majority of people in this country is in the city areas, you know.
Yeah, well, it's all about maximizing the wealth you take from the people for the least amount of upkeep, and that's basically the goal of government and bankers the world over, is to simply harvest as much wealth from the people as you can. That's what they do. That's why they go into politics and banking.
Hey, Mike, I wanted to talk about the economy of the amount of people not in the labor force. I mean, people don't realize these people are not productive. They're not producing anything, you know. It's like... pretty shameful if you think about it. I mean, what are they producing, you know?
Well, most of them are just trying to get by. I imagine by now a lot of them, at least out in the rural areas, are living off of gardens. They're planting on their own home, but we're seeing more and more of the government outlaw growing food on your own property because, again, it's all about mandating dependency on the large corporations. And remember, it was exactly that behavior by King George III that led to the American Revolution. We had to conduct all commerce with banknotes borrowed at interest from the Bank of England. We had to buy all of our tea and other goods from the British East India Company. We had to buy all of our cloth from the knitting mills of Manchester and Leeds. We were not allowed to seek alternative sources for all of this stuff. And we reached a point where we said we don't want to be dependent on the Bank of England, on the British East India Company. We want to be independent and decide for ourselves how to run our own commerce. And that was the real cause of the revolution. All this stuff about tea in Boston Harbor and the rest of it that they teach in the public schools, they go out of their way to not mention how banking was the start of the American Revolution, because 100 years ago we got sold back into that same system.
It's a shame all the money we spent on all the wars and stuff. They could have had some major reconstructions with mass transit in this country.
And we need it, Dustin. We need it desperately. The infrastructure's crumbling.
Well, with all the money that we poured in to prop up Wall Street, we could have really come up with workable alternative energy systems. So we didn't have to go down this fracking path, which is now the government's admitting they're triggering earthquakes all over the country with these fracking wells. And I don't think we want to be doing that around the area of the Yellowstone supervolcano, thank you very much.
Not a good idea.
No.
No.
But we have, like, the manufacturing. What's the manufacturing rate of this country? I mean, we have no manufacturing. China's like the world's manufacturer. I mean, what do we got left? You know?
We have cars. We have cars with airbags that fire prematurely and ignition switches that turn off. We have warplanes that asphyxiate their own pilots and otherwise don't work. And by the way, they're already starting to put the F-22s in museums because they are that completely useless.
I think the F-35 is going to be the last airplane. They're probably going to go to all drones. I don't think the U.S. Air Force pilots are going to like that.
No, they're not. But yeah, I think you're right. Everybody's looking forward to the age of the drone. But you know, I think, you know, if we ever actually get to World War IV, we're going to be fighting that one with sticks and stones.
Wasn't that what Einstein said, dear? The next World War, sticks and stones?
It's either that or Churchill.
Yeah.
One of the two.
Club a banker.
Absolutely. Like a baby seal. Boom, 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 boom. Okay.
Thanks, Mike. Have a good weekend.
All right. Thank you very much here. We're going to close the phone lines for the rest of the show here, and you wanted to finish up about the cancer.
I wanted to finish up about what this organization did and how it did it. Well, there was an investigation begun under the leadership of GAO Assistant Director Barry Tice. His group compiled a report that scathingly criticized the NCI. The report was initially titled NIH Action Spur Continued Controversy over Hydrazine Sulfate Therapy. And on June 5, 1995, the report was sent out FDA, Public Health, and NCI for review. But when the top officials at NCI got the report, eyewitnesses said that they looked like they were going ballistic, crazy. The NCI, the National Cancer Institute, went on a campaign to have the GAO change the report and succeeded.
Well, just like we're seeing with Monsanto, that's out there screaming about how the World Health Organization is saying there appears to be a link between glyphosate and certain kinds of cancers.
Yep.
And these institutes, these entities, they're not interested in fixing the problem. They just want to make the problem go away. And it seems to be a behavior of corporations going back again. If you look at the Tylenol murder cover-up, how that whole situation, they've been doing it for decades, and because of that, that's all they know how to do. They don't know how to actually solve these problems. They're not even interested. It costs too much to make a truly safe, effective product. They're just going to put out whatever it is they got a patent on, and if people die, well, there's a few lawsuits, and if it gets to be too much of a problem, that's why they set up the vaccine court in the United States, to put a limit on financial damages from dangerous vaccines. And people are supposed to go to the vaccine court, they get handed a tiny amount of money, and they're supposed to go away and say that makes it all right. And no, it really doesn't. But we are a totally fascistic economic nation where government and corporate power are perfectly aligned against ordinary people. And out of that, you get very bad, defective, dangerous products foisted on us, bad medications, and the response is, well, it's your problem. I mean, something that really angers me horribly is all of these babies that we now know were killed by getting these multiple vaccine shots, and rather than say there's a problem with the vaccine, they turned around and charged the parents with shaken baby syndrome. Now we know that doesn't even really exist. No. It's made up, like ADHD, to protect the profits of the medical corporations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If, I were to go into a doctor's office and were diagnosed as having cancer, I would say, okay, thank you for letting me know. I'm going to get back to you. And I would do as much due diligence about where I could get what had the best track record of keeping me alive the best. And I think that's important for people to do. Mm-hmm. And, Michael, you make an observation that priest robes have now been replaced by white lab coats.
Absolutely.
And I think that's absolutely correct in this situation. And I would encourage people to at least get a second opinion from someone that your doctor doesn't play golf with on Wednesday.
I mean, the reality is medical mistakes kill 400,000 Americans every single year. Medical mistake is the third leading cause of death after cancer and heart disease. And when I was sitting in that hospital room for 2 hours, having been told I had cancer, I was spending off all those brochures. I decided I was going to take that 1 in 4 chance that my cancer would go away all by itself. I didn't have to do that, but I did make the conscious decision. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Back on the line here, and we're back here. Time Warner Cable, what can I tell you? Time Warner Cable cut our internet connection, but we just got back on here. And so anyway, Claire, what did you want to talk about next?
In a cop culture, the Bill of Rights doesn't amount to much.
Well, we kind of knew that.
In a society where you can get kicked, punched, tasered, shot, intimidated, harassed, strip-searched, brutalized, terrorized, wrongfully arrested, and even killed by a police officer, and that officer is never held accountable for violating your rights and his or her oath of office, never forced to make amends, never told what he did wrong, and never made to change the way he does his work, then you don't live in a constitutional republic. You live in a police state. Now, having said that, I am very lucky that in almost 66 years of existence, I have a birthday coming up, I've never had a confrontation with a police officer, but I know that there are many in this country who are thought to be guilty until proven innocent, which is a throwback to Code Napoleon law, and just absolutely the opposite of the Constitution.
And it's important to understand that if the police are being this abusive to all Americans across the nation, okay, this has to be policy, because otherwise we would see the higher-up police officials, government officials responding to this huge outcry and doing something about it. But it took riots in Baltimore to get these 6 officers arrested for the murder of Freddie Gray, and now we're hearing that they may be let off to charges anyway. So obviously, and this is along the lines of something I said earlier in the week, the police are not here for law enforcement or crime prevention. They're here to, first of all, pillage all of us for the budgets of the local governments, and basically to brutalize us and keep us down, to keep the have-nots from standing up and annoying the haves. And that is definitely something that is going to erode our society, because the whole relationship between the public and the police depends on the public perception that only the guilty are punished in a timely manner, and the innocent and law-abiding are left alone. And yet we see the politically connected guilty going free, and police punishment applied seemingly random to everybody just going about their daily lives. And that is a big problem, and it is an indicator of how the American society is starting to break apart.
Yeah, it's got to be very uncomfortable for a lot of people out there, and I guess it's just dumb luck on my part that hasn't happened yet. But I'd like to move us over into the international arena.
Okay.
And Kerry in Riyadh, a meeting of war criminals. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry appeared side by side with his Saudi counterpart, Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir, in Saudi Arabia's capital of Riyadh Thursday, and praised the monarchy for its role in the bloody, nearly 2-month-old war against Yemen, which is the most impoverished nation in the Arab world. The Saudi royals were to be commended for their initiative to bring about a peaceful resolution through the announcement of their intent to establish a full 5-day renewable ceasefire and humanitarian pause. Now, earlier, what makes this so horrifically ironic, the Saudi warships had fired rockets into the town of Hijaz, striking the Mayadi hospital, and more than 100 airstrikes in other areas of the country. And it left scores of Yemenites dead, including women and children. And Mike, you know that old saw about one is judged by the company one keeps? Well, in this case, the U.S. government is keeping company with one of the most regressive, repressive, bloodthirsty monarchies in the world. One that thinks nothing of bombing women and children and using cluster bombs enabled by the U.S. government.
Well, they're perfect partners then. I mean, that's what remember, the U.S. government is the government that invaded Iraq on lies about nuclear weapons, set up torture centers around the world, and then, acted like they were being put upon when the American people stood up and said, look, that's not what America's supposed to be about. We're not, we're not the new Nazis with concentration camps and torture centers. Unfortunately, sadly, we are. And, but again, this is all about forcing nations back under U.S. puppet rule. Back in 2012, when the U.S. went in there and kicked out Yemen's government and put in the U.S. puppet Hadi.
Al-Hadi, yeah.
Obama stood up there and said, this is a successful U.S. intervention. And here we are with the Yemen falling apart all these years later, and Saudi Arabia is acting as a U.S. proxy to go in and reimpose U.S. puppet rule on Yemen, and nobody's being fooled by this cutout.
No.
We know this is another U.S. attempt to regain control over a nation that wants to run itself for its own benefit, its own people. And this forcing the world back to the U.S. dollar and the petrodollar, it's falling apart. The U.S. is having to go into Iraq for a third time, Yemen for a second time, Libya for a second time. They still can't get into Syria, still can't get into Iran. And the world is very rapidly coalescing new economic systems outside the U.S. sphere of influence. The U.S. is already losing this war. And I wish they would have the sense to say, all right, we blew it. We're failing this agenda. Let's pull back, bring all of our people and what's left of our wealth back home, and work on rebuilding the United States as a technological leader and manufacturing leader, rather than try and drag the rest of the world down to our current moral economic level, which is what they're doing.
Yeah, and if the Saudi government is any mirror of what the U.S. government has become, has devolved to, we can say pretty safely that this country is a repressive corporatocracy, kleptocracy, governed not by alleged representatives of we the people, but true representatives of the corporate nation state.
We're there.
We're there.
That's what the police brutality is all about. That is the tool of repression. You know, and now they're coming out here and saying the FCC is going to have the authority to control political content in the independent media. That, of course, is completely opposite to the First Amendment, but they control the content in the corporate media. Covertly, you're not supposed to know what's going on, and now they're trying to figure out some way where they can come out and say, you're not allowed to say bad things about the bad things that we do. Yeah, we are.
Yeah.
That's what America is supposed to be about. That's what the checks and balances are about.
Yeah.
What's next?
Next is too big to fail. And this is something that you don't get with the financial reports on the corporate talking heads. The top 6 bank holding companies are considerably larger than before, and they're still permitted to borrow excessively relative to the assets they hold. They are dangerously interconnected and remain vulnerable to sudden runs because they borrow billions of dollars from wholesale lenders who can often demand their cash back each and every day. The conditions that caused the meltdown earlier have not been fixed. The fundamental problem with the economy has not been fixed.
The fundamental problem is it's a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
Because under private central banking, the debt always grows faster than the available money supply. And they're just trying to tick this thing along until some other CEO is in the corporate offices or some other politician's got the seat. They're kicking the can down the road to the point where it doesn't even look like a can much anymore. It looks like a used-up gum wrapper. But that's why we're in this mess. Each succeeding administration, each succeeding Congress has always said the best way to deal with the problem is to pretend it's not a problem and just put it off until somebody else gets to take the verdict of history for letting it all fall apart. But that was always going to happen somewhere down the road. The people who set up this debt slavery system knew it would crash eventually, but after they were comfortably dead, after their lives of wealth, privilege, and power. Got to take a break for commercials. Back with the last segment of our program after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our Pauha on a Friday. And Claire, you had one more topic.
Well, I had a couple more, but I think I'm going to close with this one. A record number of Americans are giving up their U.S. citizenship in the first quarter of 2015, according to IRS data. This is blamed on the taxation of income earned outside the U.S., along with laws expanding offshore bank account and asset reporting. A total of 1,335 people renounced their U.S. citizenship in the first 3 months of this year, topping the previous record by 18%, according to data compiled by Bloomberg.
Well, there's two other factors to look at there. First of all, at this point, who can really feel any pride in being a citizen of the United States of America looking at what the U.S. is doing? Personally, I think you and I ought to renounce our citizenship and declare ourselves illegal immigrants, because then we'll get free pony rides and free, cheese and TV and medical care and all the rest of that stuff, because the illegals are getting a better deal than the citizens are here in the United States.
Yeah, it's all about swinging and swaying the elections that can't be got by voter fraud, I guess.
Something like that.
Yeah,
yeah. I have to practice my Spanish, ¿Cómo está? ¿Dónde está la casa de Pepe?
Oh, dear.
All right.
One more very quick, which I think is important. Russia and China are agreeing to integrate the Eurasian Union, Silk Road, and they've been signing deals. They've just completed a number of energy, trade, and finance deals today aimed at strengthening economic ties. The two countries have multiple mutual projects, and Russian President Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping have signed a decree of cooperation in tying the development of the Eurasian Economic Union with the Silk Road economic project. This integration is going to mean a new level of partnership and actually implies a common economic space on the continent.
Well, what's going on here, this is a continuation of a process where the rest of the world is basically realigning their economic connections to go outside the United States of America, just like they're starting to realign their data communication infrastructure outside the United States to get away from the NSA spying. As a matter of fact, Russia is now launching their own domestically produced integrated circuit computer chips to rival anything that Intel and these other companies have, with the advantage that there are no built-in back doors to these chips for people to have to worry about.
And China is also going to be investing $5.8 billion in the construction of the Moscow-Kazan high-speed railway. It's going to extend to China and connect the two countries through Kazakhstan and Central Asia. And that is a very important geopolitical piece of the puzzle here.
Well, Russia and China are out there making deals. The U.S. is out there trying to make war. And who do you think is going to prevail in the long run? Because the people of planet Earth prefer peace. We prefer commerce. We want to basically sit in our homes, in our shops, and just, roll out whatever product we have to sell and have somebody buy it, and not have some government come in and say, you are going to buy from our friends over there, which is more expensive and lower quality, and if you won't do that, we will come in and bomb your house. Because that really is, if you think about it, a very primitive way of approaching the situation. But the U.S. government has gotten itself into a horrible fix through decades of corruption, and they've done it before, and every time they get into this kind of an economic mess, they get out of it, or at least distract from it with a world war. Crash of 1907, World War I, crash of 1929, World War II, crash of 2008, and look at the behavior of the United States since then, with all the wars they've carried on.
Yeah, it's cyclical, and unfortunately will be until the United States loses.
Well, I think the United States is going to lose this war, and it's probably going to wind up going nuclear if it reaches that stage. Unfortunately, it's not just the United States. It is any nation enslaved to a private central bank gets buried in debt to the point where finally wars of conquest become the last resort to try and balance the books and pay the bankers off. As long as we allow private central banks to exist, there will be wars and world wars. Forget about ISIS, forget about Islam, forget about the rest of it. The common enemy of all mankind are private central banks creating money out of thin air and lending it into circulation at interest. It is a system of enslavement. And I don't take well to being a slave. I don't think you do either. Just because you don't see the chains doesn't mean that you are not a slave. And you are a more effective slave if you don't know you are a slave. If you're convinced that you are somehow free, even as you're writing all these checks to government agencies, to traffic court, to the IRS. That's the reality. Americans right now, spend half their lives taking care of themselves and their families, and the other half working to support the ruling structure. And that is the exact same ratio of work for self, work for the rulers that the Roman slaves lived under, and the slaves of the antebellum South, or the medieval peasants. Half for yourself, the other half goes to the rulers. I don't think we're a free people at all. We haven't been for at least 100 years with the start of the Federal Reserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the Federal Reserve is simply another private bank.
It's a privately owned central bank. The only reason they called it the Federal Reserve instead of the third bank of the United States is they thought the word federal would fool the American people into thinking this was part of the government and the Department of Treasury.
No.
But it isn't. It's no more federal than Federal Express. It's
Right.
just a name they took to fool you and bamboozle you. And for about 90 years, it worked. Last 10 years, the world is waking up. We got time enough for one more story.
The one more story that I thought was rather strange was that an Al Jazeera Islamabad bureau chief has been put on the terror list by the U.S. Why, I don't know. This guy's name is Mufaq Zaidan, who was subject of American surveillance as recently as 2012. And in June of that year, NSA produced a classified presentation in which this man appears to be both a member of Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. And beside his alleged affiliation with these groups, the NSA notes Zaidan also works for Al Jazeera. It's like, what in the world has this guy actually done to put him in the category of being a terrorist? Did he do something very raw and maybe tell the truth about...
That would do it. That'll get you on the terror watch list.
Yeah.
But we live in an age right now where people are convicted by accusation only. Oh, he's Al-Qaeda. He's ISIS. He works for Al Jazeera. That's all that you need to know.
Yeah.
No, being a member of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Al Jazeera in and of itself is not a crime in a nation where we have freedom of associating. Now, I'm personally not planning on hanging out with ISIS because I don't like, secret agents dressing up in funny robes and making videos. And we all know Al-Qaeda was a fraud from day one.
Yeah.
Okay. But, the idea that somebody's membership card, is grounds for prosecution, that goes right back to the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
Where people were having their lives and careers destroyed for having attended a meeting of the Communist Party sometime when they were very, very young. Which reminds me, there's a wonderful movie out there called The Majestic.
Oh, yeah.
With Jim Carrey, which is a really good portrait of what was going on there. Where, people who just went with a friend to a meeting and weren't even thinking about what was going on in the meeting had their lives destroyed. We don't want to go back to that, where lives can be destroyed because somebody says, we think you once met somebody in Al-Qaeda, or we think that maybe you were sympathetic to ISIS at some point.
Or you told the truth.
Or you told the truth, which is certainly is. Even Paul Craig Roberts right now is out there saying that Washington, D.C.'s main enemy right now is the truth and those with the courage to speak it. All right, we're almost to the end of this program here, and I want to leave with a little bit of a Friday evening rant, and it has to do with what we were just talking about. We are at a time right now where knowing the truth is no longer sufficient. Okay? We are at a time right now where everybody must have the courage to speak the truth, to ask the hard questions, to be our own investigative journalists and go out there and confront the corporate media and politicians and say, look, what is going on here with the fact that Saddam didn't have nuclear weapons? What is going on with, Hillary's email server? And why is the government lying to us about the unemployment numbers? And especially, why is the government borrowing from a private central bank when they can make their own money under the Constitution? You got to get out there and start getting in people's faces with this stuff. Peacefully, respectfully.
Gently,
but you got to do it. There's the music. Time for us to get out of here and get some work done and pay a few bills on this place. We will be back Monday, Time Warner willing, and we'll talk to you then. So have a good weekend. Aloha, America.